There are a few subjects, maybe, that are more confusing generally to Christians than fasting. So many questions have been asked over time, and even to me personally, about fasting. It's something that is intriguing to Christians, I think, for different reasons. Maybe even what it is not clear to so many. What exactly is fasting? Why did it seem to be such an integral part of the Old Testament and yet maybe so taboo today? And it is for many people taboo for Christians. Well, several weeks ago it was requested that we add fasting to this series, ongoing series. What does the Bible teach about fasting? In fact, the question exactly said, what does the Bible teach about fasting then and now? Which changes the question a little bit. It just elaborates or gives us a little bit of a direction and at least shows an understanding that there is a difference, or the impression at least that there is a difference between fasting then, back in the old days, you might say, the old days of Moses' law, and now under the law of Christ. Well, this morning we will seek to answer that question. What does the Bible teach about fasting? First of all, answering the question, what is fasting? The Bible teaches that fasting is an abstaining, strictly speaking, but generally, it's abstaining from food and drink. That's what we might call textbook standard fasting, is usually, if not always, connected in some way with food and drink. Now, I will say, just to go ahead and clarify, all fasting, by any definition of the term or understanding of the term, or any customization of the practice of fasting, is always abstaining from a physical something physical. And we'll see more on that in just a few minutes. But generally, fasting was abstaining from food and drink in some way, whether completely or maybe not so completely. We'll see that in a few minutes also. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 16 and 17 says, David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, and David fasted. This is whenever God had declared that his son would not live. He fasted. He went into his room and laid down and wouldn't get up. It says the elders of his house stood beside him and tried to get him to get up and come with them. It says he would not, nor would he eat food with them. So we see he fasted, and he was refusing to eat food, because that is what, in one way, fasting was. And whenever his fast ended, whenever the child died, it says that David arose from the earth and washed and anointed himself and changed his clothes. And when he asked, they set food before him, and he ate. So we see during what is called his fast, he would not eat. And when his fast was ended, he asked for food, and he ate. So fasting was abstaining generally from food and drink. But it's not simply the abstaining from these physical things, period. It's abstaining from them for a spiritual purpose, a spiritual aim. It's not dieting. Well, first of all, abstaining from food and drink in general is not a healthy diet anyway. But it's not simply abstaining from them, but it's with a spiritual purpose in mind. And that spiritual purpose can vary, but it's always abstaining from something physical for a spiritual purpose, or trying to achieve some spiritual goal. Matthew 4, verse 2, when Jesus went out into the wilderness, it says, after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. There's another connection. He was hungry because he had just fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, which means he was abstaining from food and drink to some extent at least. Acts 23:12, the Jews against Paul made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. That's basically saying that they bound themselves that they would fast until they had killed Paul. Of course, their spiritual purpose was utterly misguided, but we at least see the abstaining from food and drink in that connection. So, fasting is abstaining from something physical, generally food and drink. Number 2, the Bible teaches that fasting was practiced by God's people under the Old Covenant. Quite, to our impression, maybe quite extensively practiced, pretty commonly. It's important to note that there was only one required fast under the Old Covenant. Leviticus 16:31 says that it's on the Day of Atonement. It says it's a Sabbath of solemn rest to you. You shall afflict yourselves, which is maybe an obscure word, but the idea is with fasting. You afflict yourselves with fasting is the implication, and we see that connection in other places to help us connect those dots. You shall afflict yourselves, or some versions say humble yourselves, translate that word humble yourselves, but the idea is with fasting. That's the only one that God ever commanded. Once a year. However, the people under the Old Covenant did fast under different circumstances. They did fast. We read of many examples of fasting. Psalm 35:13 says, But I, when they were sick, I wore sackcloth. I afflicted myself with fasting. There again is that phrase spelled out rather than just saying I afflicted myself. So I wore sackcloth when these loved ones of mine were sick, and I fasted. Psalm 69:10, when I wept and humbled my soul with fasting, it became my reproach. Isaiah 58:3, why have we fasted and you see it not? Why have we humbled ourselves and you take no knowledge of it? We also see in some of these examples how fasting was a means of self-humiliation or self-humbling rather, which again shows that spiritual aim and spiritual purpose. Jeremiah 36:6, so you're to go, and on a day of fasting in the hearing of all the people in Jehovah's house, you shall read the words of Jehovah from the scroll you've written. So we see this custom of a day of fasting. Though it wasn't pronounced by God, they did it of their own free will, which is really the intention of fasting in the first place. Other passages also give us the idea that it was a regular custom and practice by God's people in the Old Testament to fast. Beyond that, we see a pattern that fasting was most commonly done in connection with mourning and prayer. Many times, or at least several times in the Old Testament, frequently, at times you will see, even in the same phrase, prayer and fasting. I fasted and prayed, and things like that. This connection there of praying and fasting, almost like it's all one thing. I prayed and fasted, or fasted and prayed. Again, in 2 Samuel 12, the text says, David therefore sought God on behalf of the child, and David fasted. And then he said himself, a few verses later, while the child was still alive, I fasted and wept, for I said, who knows whether Jehovah will be gracious to me? So you see, he was fasting as a part of his seeking God. He sought God on behalf of the child and fasted. Luke 5, verses 33 through 35, some people came and sort of criticized Jesus' disciples and said, John's disciples fast, but yours don't. How come? Why don't your disciples fast like John's do? And Jesus said, is it possible for men to fast when the bridegroom is with them? He said, the days are coming when the bridegroom will be taken away from them, and then they'll fast. You see the connection between mourning and fasting. Can't fast when you're happy. It's something you do when you're in mourning, he implies by that statement. Nehemiah 1:4 says, as soon as I heard these words, this bad news about Jerusalem, I sat down and wept and mourned for days, and I continued fasting and praying. Weeping, mourning, praying, and fasting. Daniel 9:3, I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking Him by prayer and pleas for mercy with fasting. Ezra 8:23, so we fasted and implored our God for this, and He listened to our entreaty. So many times, fasting is almost inseparable from praying or beseeching God or imploring God, which is why I have in the past sort of referred to it, as far as the people were concerned, it's almost like a means of supercharging your prayer. Now, as we'll see in just a second, in fact, we could probably go ahead and look at it. Number 4, there is no evidence that fasting actually increases the likelihood of favorable answers to prayers. And I probably should put an asterisk next to that because it may be implied, we might say, but for certainty, all we can say is that what's implied is that they viewed it to maybe have some impact on the favorableness with which God would view their prayer. We don't see any evidence, especially today, that will actually make God more likely to give you the answer that you want. So that is an important point to note, that even though the people in the Old Testament did seem to view that fasting somehow aided their prayers, and that may be an assumption in itself. Maybe they didn't think of it like that at all, and they just, whatever was causing them to pray also caused them to fast. But if we do interpret it that way, there's still no evidence for us today that I can sort of manipulate God to have to answer my prayer more favorably if I fast first. We could see how that could easily be misconstrued. That's not far from idolatry. If you remember Balaam, and when he was trying to get Jehovah to turn against Israel, they were making sure they did everything just right to get Jehovah to hear them, like he's some sort of animal, and we got to do it just right to get him, to lure him out to us, to listen to us. Got to be on this high hill and offer the perfect amount of, that was their idolatrous mindset being applied to true religion of the one true God. But even if we do pair our prayer with fasting, doesn't necessarily mean that God will view it in a way of saying, well, I wouldn't have said yes to this prayer, but since you fasted, I'll go ahead and give it to you. There's no evidence that God operates in that way. Number 5, the Bible teaches that fasting is voluntary, strictly voluntary under the new covenant. It was 99% voluntary under the old covenant. But it's 100% voluntary under the new covenant. And if we think about it, it's better that way anyway, because anything that's done with a spiritual purpose or aim needs to come out of the person's own free will, their heart. That's not to say that God didn't have his reasons for mandating one of the fasts. There was a reason for that. But every other time somebody fasted, it was because they wanted to in their heart for that spiritual purpose, whether it was mourning, whether it was during a time of prayer, whether it was during a time of great spiritual need. They did it of their own free will and their own accord. So it's voluntary. There's not any scriptures to pair with this simply because there of the absence of any command for people to fast. What we do see, however, number 6, is that the Bible teaches that fasting is something that Jesus assumed that his followers would do. This one may come as a shock to us. What do you mean Jesus assumed that we would be doing it? Well, we know he did, because in Matthew 6, where Ron just read a second ago, Jesus said, when you fast like this. Very, very much like he said, when you pray like this. When you fast like this. Don't fast like this, but fast like this. Well, if nothing else, it just shows this point, that Jesus assumed, he took for granted that his followers would be doing it. Now, somebody might say, well, that's because they were Jews. He was a Jew, he lived under the Old Covenant, and they were Jews, and they lived under the Old Covenant. Well, if that's the way we should interpret that, then we're going to have to start interpreting many of Jesus' teachings that way. As, in other words, doesn't apply to us. If we start doing that, we're going to be we're not going to have very many teachings left of Jesus. Well, he did that. He said that because they were Jews. And therefore, we're not Jews, so it doesn't apply to us. Well, Jesus' teachings were always anticipatory of what's coming, the new covenant. You've heard that it was said, but I say to you, so and so. So while this is not necessarily a command to fast, it does at least show that Jesus assumed that his followers would be doing it. It's something that they would do. So since it's not a command, and it's just assuming that they would do it, it doesn't necessarily indicate that fasting is required for Christians, but it does show that it's acceptable for Christians. It's something that Christians can do, and in some instances we might even say should do. Although we don't say that very often, do we? We would never pair should and fasting in the same sentence. But maybe we're wrong for that. Wayne Jackson said, fasting for the Christian is strictly voluntary. It should arise out of a feeling of intense need, not as the result of a mere ritual or formality, which is true of anything we do in relation to God. I shouldn't be here today because I think I have to be here. I should be here because I want to be here, because I understand the need, not because of rituals or formalities or just checking off a list. So fasting is something that Jesus assumed his followers would do, and that alone may be enough for us to rethink maybe whatever we may have thought in the past about fasting. Number 7, the Bible teaches that fasting does not always have to be about food and drink. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, Paul brings up a subject that certainly has nothing to do with food or drink, but is a kind of fasting, if you will. He's talking about a husband and wife. And in verses 2 through 5, he basically, I'll paraphrase as carefully as I can. He said, let the husband render unto the wife her due, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. Maybe I'll just read it from this old version, and it sort of encodes it on its own. So, the wife does not have power over her own body, but the husband, and likewise also the husband doesn't have power over his own body, but the wife. And he says, do not deprive one another, except it be by consent for a season, that you may give yourselves unto prayer, and then come together again, so that you're not tempted by Satan. Notice what he said is, don't deprive each other, man and wife, unless you agree for a short period of time so that you may devote yourselves to prayer. Well, what's Paul talking about? He's talking about abstaining for a short time from some physical desire or need so that you may focus on praying. Well, what's that? It's a spiritual thing. So you're temporarily depriving yourself with the consent of your spouse, of course, so that you can devote yourselves to prayer, and then when that period is over, you come back together. That's a kind of fasting, but it has nothing to do with food or drink. So you see, fasting doesn't always have to be about food and drink, and if it can be about what Paul is talking about in 1 Corinthians 7, we could fast in other ways too. But the key is, it's about depriving yourself, for lack of a better word, of something physical for a temporary time in a spiritual aim or purpose. In this case, he specifies devoting yourself to prayer. So during this, I don't know, say a week, whatever the time is irrelevant, for some definite time period, I'm not going to partake in that thing. Whether it's all food, whether it's a certain kind of food. There's another thing we may take for granted, that fasting is either all or nothing. You either don't eat a single bite of food or drink a single drink of water, in which case your fast is not going to last very long, and your family will be fasting soon and out of mourning for the loss of your life, so maybe it won't be the best idea. But it doesn't always necessarily have to be all food and all drink every time. Maybe I can just abstain from a certain kind of food. Maybe the kind of food that I love the most would be, if I'm going to pick one out, that's the one. Of course, it would be easy to pick, I'm not going to eat vegetables for a whole month. God's going to look down and say, nice try, buddy. You don't eat vegetables anyway, so you're not fooling me. But the thing I want the most, the thing I like the most, the thing I crave the most, that's what sends the message. And again, we're not sending messages to people, which we'll see in the next point, but to God and ourselves. Number 8, the Bible teaches that fasting can be done in a sinful manner. How is it that a good thing can be done in a sinful way? There's lots of good things that can be done in a sinful way. Jesus warned against it. Paul warned against it, even with fasting. That was his whole point in Matthew 6. When you fast, don't do it like the hypocrites. You know what they do? They try to make themselves look like they're dying, basically. They don't wash their faces. They don't take care of themselves. They make it look like they're just on the verge of death to try to impress people. Get people's attention. Wow, look how holy he is. He's on the verge of death because he's so dedicated to God and he's depriving himself of food. Wow. It's not just that people happen to see that by coincidence or mistake, but they do things to aid to make that happen. Jesus uses the example of by implication, not washing their faces, making their faces seem just doing things to manipulate, and they want to be seen by people, which totally makes the fast devoid of all spiritual value. And that's why Jesus says, I'll tell you, they've received their reward already. Because the attention of the men is not only the reward that they're wanting to get, it's the only one they're going to get. God doesn't see that. God doesn't see any value in a fast that's just done for men's attention. So fasting can be done in a sinful way. Going back to 1 Corinthians 7, we see how that kind of fast can be done in a sinful way, whether it's not with the consent of the spouse or whether it's, indefinite. That's not healthy. That's not right. It opens the door for temptation. It deprives beyond reason. So that would not be the right way to do it as far as Paul's instruction in 1 Corinthians 7. Luke 18, in the parable of the two men that go to the temple to pray, the Pharisee and the publican, the Pharisee prays and says, I thank you, God, I'm not like other men. I fast twice a week and in a boastful, prideful way. That's not right either. That's similar to what Jesus was talking about in getting the praise of men. So fasting can be done in a sinful way, and we should take that into consideration if that's something that we may be interested in doing, that to be careful not to do it in a useless or sinful way, but do it in the correct way. Which leads us to number 9. The Bible teaches that fasting is to be strictly between the faster and God. Now, there are many things in the Christian life that are not supposed to simply be between you and God. We might say ultimately most things are, or at the end of the day, but that's not necessarily true with many things. Worship is not supposed to simply be between you and God. That's why we assemble for worship. If worship was just between me and God, I would have no reason to be here today. But the New Testament does indicate that we have a reason to be here. And it has nothing to do with God necessarily. And has to do with you and your brothers and sisters and God, everybody involved. But fasting is one of those things that is supposed to be strictly between the one fasting and God. Just like Jesus said with prayer. When you pray, don't go out on the street corner and really try to make a show of it, using all sorts of, pretty phrases and really biblical things, and just for the same reason as fasting. Boy, man, that man is truly holy and righteous. He sure does know and love his God. Again, Jesus said, they've already received their reward. Don't do that. He said, go to your own room. Get in your closet and kneel down and pray to God in private. It's the same thing he says with fasting. He says, when you fast, Don't do it so that men can see. Wash your face. You do the opposite. You make efforts to make sure that your fasting is not known, not visible, not to be seen by men. You make efforts that it's not going to be detected, which also just goes without mentioning, telling people about it. Because if you tell people about it, it doesn't matter if it's visible or not. You've gone ahead and done it anyway. But he says, if you do that, your Father will see in secret. And your Father who is in secret will reward you openly. So the idea is that when you fast, it's supposed to be a secret. That's the word Jesus uses. It's supposed to be between you and God. Not for show, not for praise of men, but just between you and God. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you. Finally, number 10, the Bible teaches that fasting, just sort of putting everything together, it can be a very spiritually profitable exercise for a Christian. There are many things about fasting back then that we may not really know the answers to. It's sort of like, but not entirely like, casting lots. We read about the practice of casting lots. We don't really know what in the world was going on there, how it worked. There's only one instance of casting lots in the New Testament, and it's whenever they were choosing the replacement for Judas, which was right before the church was established. Never again do we read about men casting lots, at least Christians casting lots. So we don't really know how it worked. We just know that it did somehow. There are a lot of questions we have maybe about fasting that we just don't know the answers to. But as far as today is concerned, we know that it's something that is certainly acceptable for Christians to practice. We know that Jesus at least assumed that at least some of his followers would do it. And based on what Paul said, fasting of a certain type is something that he encouraged with care, not to get carried away in that way. So in light of all that we read in the New Testament about fasting, we can at least conclude that it's something that is acceptable to do, and it potentially could have a lot of benefits. There are some people, some medical people, experts, who even suggest that it can be physically beneficial to abstain from certain types of food for certain periods of time. I can't really speak to that. That's just maybe an added bonus, because that's not what fasting's for. As far as we know, it's for spiritual things. And it can be a very spiritually profitable exercise. At the very least, if the Lord took for granted that his followers would do it, and if we see that some of his followers did it, we do read about the church in Antioch fasted and prayed before they sent Paul and Barnabas out. We read of another instance where they fasted and prayed. So we do know that Christians did it occasionally. Then we should at least conclude that they might be onto something there. Maybe there is some spiritual benefit that I wouldn't even been able to have comprehended. But it might be there if I do it. Who's to say? Again, Wayne Jackson, in an article he wrote about fasting several years ago, he said, fasting may be spiritually beneficial in times of personal sorrow. We've already seen instances of that. He said, fasting frequently accompanied repentance as an outward and genuine indication of contrition. Think about Nineveh. When Jonah preached, they fasted in their repentance. 1 Samuel 7:6, we see fasting with repentance. Fasting was in connection with great and important religious events in the Old Covenant. The church fasted before sending Barnabas and Saul out, we saw. And fasting was certainly a at least somewhat regular part of Paul's ministry. 2 Corinthians 6:5, 2 Corinthians 11:27. So, while there are no explicit commands for Christians to fast, that's not to say that it's not something that Christians should do. After all, we do have at least a little bit of New Testament precedent for fasting. It seems that God in some way honors fasting when it's performed in the right way, as a token of sincere dedication and appreciation. It's been said by some people who do practice it that the mind is able to maybe go into greater depths in contemplation during a time of fasting like that. How can I say any different if I've not practiced it the way they do? It can help somebody to maybe get a better grasp on a self-discipline in an area. Maybe I struggle with something, and fasting in some way, unforeseeable way, helps me to maybe do that more effectively. Reinforces our appreciation. Practically speaking, fasting is really about demonstrating, both to God and yourself, first of all, that you don't rely on the physical things. That may be the most obvious. I do not rely on the desires of the flesh and the physical needs of the body, or mind for that matter. That's a message that fasting sends to God and to yourself. It sends a message that you're in control of your fleshly appetites instead of the other way around. It shows that you're placing the spiritual above the physical. You're willing to sacrifice the physical in favor of the former, spiritual things. We could say that all day long. I'm willing to sacrifice physical for spiritual. But when we fast, we're actually demonstrating that. We might want to remind ourselves, yes, God knows my mind, and He knows if I really am willing, just like He knew Abraham's faith before He asked him to sacrifice Isaac. God knew what He was going to do, and yet He still asked him to do it because He proved it, both to Himself and to God. Proved what He might claim otherwise. And it shows that your ultimate dependency and allegiance is on God. Your ultimate allegiance is to God, not on anything physical or anything of the flesh. So with those things in mind, why wouldn't a Christian at least try it? What could it hurt to try? I might think, that's a bunch of baloney. That's doesn't work like that. How do you know? I can't say that. Who knows what new spiritual depths you might unlock by introducing the practice of fasting. Don't let the maybe misuse of other people around us in society of fasting, their misrepresentation or misapplication of fasting, deter you from appropriate fasting in the way that Christians did in the New Testament. We often do that. Well, these people talk about fasting a lot, and they do it, and it sort of puts me off, so I don't like the concept of fasting. Well, the wrong concept of fasting shouldn't make us judge the right concept of fasting. So why not try? But for now, at least, ask yourself, where is my allegiance? Where's my dependency? Is my focus and dependence on God and on the spiritual things, or is it on myself and the physical things? Even if we don't try to supercharge our spirituality with fasting, let us at least recharge our focus and dedication to God and spiritual things in some way. If you don't want to do it with fasting, do it in some way. With prayer, with simple meditation, with Bible study, Bible reading, whatever. If you're not going to do it with fasting, do it with something. The aim is always to be growing spiritually, and fasting is just one of many ways that we know that Christians did to aid them in their spiritual growth. So why not try? You never know.